At exactly 7:12 on a Tuesday morning, I stood in front of a coffee shop register holding a paper cup that cost $2.89. The cashier smiled politely as she tapped the screen. "I'm sorry, sir. It says your card was declined." I frowned. "That's strange. Try it again." She did. Another beep. "Declined." A young man waiting behind me shifted impatiently. A woman farther back sighed loud enough for everyone to hear. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a second card. "This one should work." It didn't. The cashier looked embarrassed for me. "I'm really sorry." I could feel heat rising into my face. It wasn't the price of the coffee. It was the feeling every American over a certain age knows too well, that invisible moment when strangers begin wondering if you've become confused, forgetful, or incapable. I swallowed my pride. "It's all right," I said quietly. "I'll come back another time." I left the coffee on the counter and walked outside into the cool spring air. The morning traffic rolled past as if nothing had happened. I pulled out my phone and called my son. He answered on the second ring. "Morning, Dad." "My cards were declined." There was a brief silence. Then he sighed. Yeah, we canceled them." I actually thought I'd misheard him. "You what? We canceled your credit cards." My grip tightened around the phone. "Why would you do that?" His voice stayed calm, almost rehearsed. "Dad, you're 70. You've been forgetting things lately. We thought it was time to simplify your finances." "I haven't forgotten anything." Before he answered, I heard another voice in the background. My daughter-in-law. She wasn't whispering. She wanted me to hear. "I told you he'd be upset." Then she took the phone. "Hi, Harold." She laughed a short, dismissive laugh that made my stomach tighten. "If you need money, just ask us before you spend a dime." For a second, I couldn't speak. She continued. "It'll be easier for everyone." Everyone, not me, everyone else. I looked through the windshield at people walking into the coffee shop carrying laptops, gym bags, and briefcases. Their morning continued exactly as planned. Mine had just changed forever. I could have argued. I could have shouted. Instead, I simply said 4 words. "I understand. Thank you." Then I hung up. I didn't drive home. I drove straight to my bank. I've lived in the same Ohio town for 36 years. When my wife Linda and I bought our little brick ranch house in 1988, interest rates were high, but we believed in paying our debts and building something solid. We raised one son there. We celebrated birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings, and anniversaries under that roof. Linda passed away from pancreatic cancer 4 years ago. Some mornings I still caught myself reaching across the bed before remembering she wasn't there anymore. Grief changes shape over time. It never really disappears. It simply becomes quieter. After retiring from civil engineering, I settled into a routine that gave my days structure. Tuesday mornings were my favorite. Coffee, the local newspaper, a quick stop at the bank if I needed cash. Sometimes lunch with an old coworker. Simple, predictable, peaceful. My son Brian lived only 20 minutes away with his wife Melissa and our 2 grandchildren. I loved those kids more than life itself. Brian called every Sunday. Melissa usually organized holiday dinners. From the outside, we looked like a close family. Maybe we even believed we were. About 8 months earlier, Brian had suggested helping me modernize my finances. "Dad," he'd said while setting up my new phone, "everything's online now." I admitted technology wasn't my favorite thing. He offered to help. He connected my bank account to online banking, set up automatic bill payments, installed banking apps, updated passwords, changed security settings. "It'll protect you from scams," he explained. Melissa agreed. There are so many seniors getting taken advantage of. It sounded reasonable. I trusted them. After all, he was my son. The bank manager, Susan Reynolds, had known me for nearly 15 years. The moment she saw me walk through the front doors, she smiled. "Good morning, Harold." I hope so. Something in my voice must have concerned her. "Everything all right?" "I don't think it is." 5 minutes later, we were sitting inside her office. She opened my account. Almost immediately, her expression changed. She stopped typing, then looked back at the screen, then at me. "Mr. Walker." "What's wrong?" She hesitated. "I'm seeing several recent changes." "What kind of changes?" She slowly turned the monitor toward me. "The mailing address on your account was updated yesterday." I leaned closer. It wasn't my address. It was Brian's. My chest tightened. Susan continued. "The primary phone number was also changed." Again, Brian's number. The email address, Melissa's email. I stared at the screen without saying a word. When did this happen? Yesterday afternoon. I wasn't here yesterday. I know. She clicked through another page. I'm also seeing that all replacement cards were mailed to the updated address. I blinked. What replacement cards? The new cards issued after the previous ones were canceled. I felt as though someone had quietly removed the floor beneath my chair. I never requested replacement cards. Susan folded her hands carefully. Did you authorize these changes? No. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she picked up the phone inside her office. Could you ask Kevin from Fraud Services to come down? Her voice remained calm. Mine didn't. Fraud? We just want to understand what's happened. 10 minutes later, Kevin joined us carrying a tablet. He introduced himself politely before reviewing the account. His questions were simple. Have you lost your identification? No. Did you authorize anyone to manage your banking? My son helped me set up online banking. Does he have your passwords? I suppose he does. Kevin exchanged a quick glance with Susan. Not dramatic, professional, experienced. The kind of look people give each other when they've seen something like this before. He scrolled through additional records. There are authorization forms attached to your account. I've never signed anything recently. They appear to grant another individual administrative access. My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. That only happens when the shock becomes too big to process. Kevin enlarged one of the digital documents. There are electronic signatures. He rotated the tablet toward me. I recognized my name, Harold Walker, written exactly as I always signed it. Only, I hadn't signed it. Not this, not ever. I looked up. Can signatures be copied? Kevin answered carefully. That's one possibility. Susan leaned forward. Mr. Walker, before we make any assumptions, we'd like to review every change made to your account over the past several months. Several months. She nodded. Sometimes situations like this don't happen all at once. Kevin quietly added something that made my stomach drop. They happen one small step at a time. For the first time that morning, I stopped thinking about the declined coffee. It had never been about $2.89. That tiny transaction had simply been the first crack in a wall someone else had been building for months. And I suddenly realized I had no idea how much of my life was already standing on the other side of it. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was angry. Anger comes with heat. It makes you want to slam doors, raise your voice, and demand explanations. What I felt was colder than anger. It was disbelief. I sat in my living room with the television on mute, staring at a framed photograph of Linda, taken the summer before she got sick. We were standing on the porch after repainting the house. She had paint on the tip of her nose because I'd flicked a brush at her. She'd laughed so hard the neighbor came outside to see what was going on. Linda used to tell me, when something doesn't make sense, don't rush to fix it. First understand it. She had been right about a lot of things. That night I decided I wasn't going to call Brian. Not yet. If there was one thing 38 years as an engineer had taught me, it was that you never started repairing a bridge before figuring out why it cracked. The next morning I was back at the bank. Susan greeted me with a sympathetic smile. We've been reviewing everything. Kevin from Fraud Services joined us again, carrying a thicker file than the day before. He spread several printed pages across the conference table. I think it's easier if we go through this chronologically. I nodded. He pointed to the earliest record. 8 months ago, online banking credentials were reset. That didn't surprise me. Brian had helped me set everything up around then. The next month, Kevin continued, a secondary contact was added to your account. Brian, then Melissa. 3 weeks later, transaction alerts were redirected. Redirected where? To your son's phone. I looked up sharply. I stopped receiving fraud alerts. According to these records, yes. I slowly leaned back in my chair. Every small change by itself sounded harmless. Together, they formed something entirely different. Kevin slid another page toward me. 3 months ago, spending limits were modified. I never asked for spending limits. He nodded. They were lowered. To what? He hesitated. $500. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so absurd. I'd spent 40 years managing million-dollar construction projects. Now someone had quietly decided I needed permission to spend more than $500 of my own money. Susan spoke gently. Mr. Walker, we also found no evidence that money has been stolen. Then what is this? She chose her words carefully. It appears to be increasing control. That phrase stayed with me. Increasing control. Not robbery. Control. Driving home memories began fitting together in ways they never had before. Last Thanksgiving, Melissa had insisted on paying the restaurant bill before I could reach for my wallet. "You've done enough for this family," she'd said with a smile. At the time, I'd thought it was kindness. Now I remembered something else. She'd casually asked, "Are you still carrying all those credit cards? That's probably confusing." I hadn't thought twice about it. Then there was Christmas. Brian had offered to organize my tax records. "Dad, it'll save you the headache." I appreciated the help, but afterward he asked strangely specific questions. "How much do you keep in checking? Any CDs coming due? Did you ever update your beneficiaries?" At the time, I assumed he was thinking ahead. Now I wondered if he'd been taking inventory. By Thursday afternoon, I found myself parked outside the law office of Daniel Mercer. Daniel had written Linda's and my wills nearly 15 years earlier. He wasn't flashy. He drove an aging Ford Explorer and still kept paper files stacked neatly in his office. More importantly, he had earned my trust. He looked genuinely surprised when I walked in. "Harold." He stood and shook my hand. "It's been too long. I wish this were a social visit." His smile faded. We spent nearly an hour going over everything. The decline cards, the banking changes, the signatures. Daniel never interrupted. When I finished, he folded his hands. "I want to see every document." The bank had already emailed copies. He adjusted his reading glasses and began reviewing them. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, he removed his glasses. "Something isn't right." "You noticed it too," he nodded. "These authorization forms concern me." "Because of the signatures?" "Partly." He pointed to one paragraph. "This document references discussions that supposedly took place in my office. They never happened." "I know." He looked directly at me. "Because I wasn't involved." Silence settled over the room. Daniel had never been dramatic. If anything, he tended to understate problems. So when he leaned back and said quietly, "I think you should proceed very carefully," I listened. "What do I do? For now?" He closed the file. "Nothing." I frowned. "Nothing. Don't confront your son." "Why not?" "Because if someone believes they've succeeded, they tend to stop hiding what they're doing." He let that sink in. People become careless when they think they've already won. Before I left, Daniel asked a question that seemed unrelated. "Has anyone mentioned assisted living recently?" I froze. "Why would you ask that?" "Answer the question." I rubbed my chin. "A few times." "Who?" "Melissa." "How often?" I thought back. "At Easter, after church one Sunday, again during my granddaughter's birthday party. Always casually, always framed as concern. Dad, wouldn't it be nice not worrying about yard work? Imagine having people cook your meals. You'd have friends your own age." I had always smiled and changed the subject. Daniel slowly nodded. "I've seen this pattern before." My stomach tightened. "What pattern?" "Sometimes financial control comes before bigger decisions." "Like what?" "Declaring someone incapable of managing their own affairs." I stared at him. "No. I'm not saying that's what's happening, but it's possible. It's possible." That evening, I drove home by a different route. Without thinking, I passed one of the newer retirement communities on the edge of town. Beautiful landscaping, walking paths, white rocking chairs on wide porches. There wasn't anything wrong with the place. In fact, it looked lovely, if someone chose to live there. The key word being chose. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. About 6 weeks earlier, Melissa had handed me a glossy brochure. "I just thought you'd like to look." I hadn't even opened it. She'd smiled anyway. "No pressure." I wondered if there had been pressure all along, just invisible. Friday morning, Daniel called. "I've been digging." "What did you find was property records?" My heart skipped. "What about them? Your house isn't the issue." "What is?" "I found emails." "Emails?" "Not yours." He paused. "I believe your son contacted a real estate agent several weeks ago." My grip tightened around the phone. "What did he say?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "He asked what your neighborhood homes were selling for." I felt sick. "He can't sell my house." "No," Daniel's voice remained calm, "but someone planning ahead might still want to know its value." After we hung up, I sat alone at my kitchen table. The same table where Linda and I had balanced checkbooks, helped Brian with homework, planned vacations we could barely afford. Every scratch in the wood carried a memory. I ran my hand across its surface. This wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't even about the house. It was about something much harder to accept. Someone I had spent a lifetime protecting had quietly decided I no longer deserved to make decisions about my own life. Late that afternoon, Daniel called one more time. His tone was different, more serious. I need you to come by first thing Monday. Did you find something else? Yes. What is it? He was silent for a moment before answering. I believe they may already be preparing paperwork that questions your ability to manage your own affairs. I closed my eyes. Outside my kitchen window, the flag Linda had insisted we fly every summer stirred gently in the breeze. For the first time since that Tuesday morning, I understood this wasn't simply a family disagreement. It was a race. And if I made one careless move, I might lose far more than a credit card. Daniel was waiting for me Monday morning with a yellow legal pad, 2 folders, and a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. He closed the office door before either of us spoke. I spent the weekend thinking about your situation. I've been doing the same. I imagine you have. He slid one of the folders across the desk. I don't want to alarm you unnecessarily, Harold, but I also don't want you making decisions based on emotion. I nodded. What do you recommend? He leaned back. For now, let them believe exactly what they already believe. I frowned, meaning that you're unaware. I stared at him. That feels dishonest. It's strategic. He folded his hands. If Brian and Melissa think you figured everything out, they'll become defensive overnight. They'll stop communicating, they'll delete records, and they'll start explaining away every decision they've made. And if they think I don't know, they'll continue behaving naturally. He paused. And people reveal far more through ordinary behavior than they ever do under interrogation. Driving home, I kept replaying his advice. I'd never been much of an actor. Linda used to say she always knew when I was planning a surprise because I couldn't hide anything. Now I had to hide the biggest discovery of my life. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted the truth. That afternoon, Brian called. Hey, Dad. His voice sounded cheerful, almost relieved. You doing okay? I'm managing. I've been meaning to stop by. You're welcome anytime. How about dinner tomorrow? Sounds good. He hesitated. And don't worry about the credit cards. Everything's under control. I forced myself to answer calmly. I appreciate you looking out for me. There was a pause. Then he laughed softly. I knew you'd understand. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time. The hardest part wasn't pretending. It was hearing my own son mistake my silence for surrender. The next evening, Brian and Melissa arrived carrying takeout from my favorite Italian restaurant. Melissa hugged me. How are you feeling? I'm fine. You seem tired. I didn't sleep well. She exchanged a quick glance with Brian. So did you remember to take your blood pressure medication? I've been taking it for 12 years. She smiled. I know, just checking. The conversation drifted from the grandchildren's soccer games to rising grocery prices. Nothing unusual. Until dessert. Brian cleared his throat. Dad. Yeah. I've been thinking. I imagine you have. He smiled. Managing finances can get stressful as we get older. I simply listened. We don't want you worrying about bills or scammers. Melissa reached across the table and gently touched my hand. You've spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. She sounded sincere, almost convincing. Now let us take care of you. I looked at both of them, then nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. Relief washed across their faces. I don't think either of them noticed. That relief told me more than any argument ever could. Over the next 2 weeks, I became the version of me they seemed to expect. I called Brian before making larger purchases, not because I needed permission, because I wanted to see how he'd respond. One afternoon, I said, I need to replace my lawnmower. He asked, how much is it? Around $600. There was silence. Finally, he replied, why don't you wait a while? We should talk about it first. Talk about it, as if I were a teenager asking to borrow the family car. Another time I mentioned taking a weekend fishing trip with an old coworker. Melissa immediately asked, do you think that's safe? I've been fishing for 50 years. I know. Her smile never faded. But accidents happen. The conversation always sounded reasonable, individually, collectively. Every suggestion pointed in the same direction. Smaller life, fewer choices, less independence. Daniel encouraged me to document everything, so I bought a spiral notebook. Nothing fancy. Every conversation went into it. Dates, times, exact wording. Whenever Brian or Melissa made a decision for me without asking, I wrote it down. Whenever they referred to our plan for my future, I wrote that down too. I also started printing emails, text messages, voicemails. Nothing was dramatic. In fact, that was what made it unsettling. Control rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as convenience. The bank's fraud department continued its review. Kevin called every few days. We've identified additional account changes. Anything illegal? We're still determining that. What does that mean? It means intent matters. He explained that helping an elderly parent wasn't against the law. Neither was assisting with online banking. The question was whether those actions had crossed the line into unauthorized control. There are gray areas, he said, but some of these records concern us. What concerns you most? The cumulative pattern. Again, that phrase. Not one event. The pattern. One Saturday morning, I stopped by my favorite hardware store. I've known the owner, Frank Collins, for nearly 20 years. He looked up from stocking shelves. Harold. Morning. Haven't seen you lately. I've been busy. We wandered through the gardening section, talking about tomatoes and mulch. Then he asked an innocent question. So when are you moving? I stopped walking. What? I thought Brian said you were downsizing. He told you that. Frank shrugged. Couple weeks ago. What exactly did he say? He mentioned you'd probably sell your place before winter. I forced a smile. Nothing's been decided. Oh. Frank looked genuinely confused. I figured everything was already in motion. I drove home with my stomach in knots. Brian wasn't just planning. He was talking about those plans as if they were already settled, without ever asking me. A few days later, something unexpected happened. My next-door neighbor, Judge Walter Henderson, caught me while I was bringing in my trash cans. Walter had retired from the county probate court several years earlier. He and his wife had lived beside us since before Brian was born. You got a minute? He asked. Sure. We sat on my front porch. He didn't waste time. I had lunch with Frank Collins. I smiled faintly. News travels fast. It does in small towns. He looked directly at me. Is everything all right? I considered giving the usual answer. Fine. Everything's fine. Instead, I said, no. Walter listened quietly as I explained the situation. He never interrupted. When I finished, he folded his arms. I saw too many cases like this. You think Brian's trying to steal from me? He shook his head. Maybe. Maybe not. Then what? I think good intentions can slowly become entitlement. He let that settle. I watched families convince themselves they were helping while taking away someone's voice one decision at a time. He reached into his pocket and handed me a business card. Evelyn Brooks. Who's she? The best elder law attorney I ever saw in my courtroom. I already have Daniel. You do, Walter smiled. And Daniel's excellent. He tapped the card. But Evelyn specializes in one thing. What? Protecting competent older adults from being treated as if they aren't. That evening, Daniel called. His voice carried an excitement I hadn't heard before. I think we've caught a break. What happened? One of the documents Brian sent to a financial advisor was accidentally copied to the wrong email address. My heart started pounding. What did it say? I can't discuss every detail over the phone. Just tell me the important part. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he read the subject line aloud. Dad doesn't know yet. Those 4 words echoed in my ears long after we hung up. Dad doesn't know yet. Maybe they believed I was confused. Maybe they believed I was vulnerable. Maybe they even believed they were protecting me. But one thing had become unmistakably clear. They were making plans about my future, as if I no longer deserved to be part of the conversation. By the time June arrived, my life had split into 2 separate worlds. In one world, I was simply Harold Walker, a retired engineer who mowed his lawn every Thursday, attended church on Sundays, and spoiled his grandchildren whenever he got the chance. In the other, I was quietly building a case against my own son. Some mornings, I still couldn't believe those 2 worlds belonged to the same person. I hated every minute of it. But Daniel reminded me often, you're not building a case against Brian. You're building a record of the truth. There was a difference. One sought punishment, the other sought clarity. That distinction became the only thing keeping bitterness from taking root in my heart. Daniel arranged a meeting with Evelyn Brooks. Judge Henderson had been right. Within 10 minutes of speaking with her, I understood why she'd earned such a reputation. She wasn't dramatic. She was precise. She listened far more than she spoke. When I finished telling my story, she asked only one question. Mr. Walker, has any physician ever diagnosed you with dementia, cognitive impairment, or diminished capacity? No. When was your last physical? About 3 months ago. Any concerns noted? My doctor told me to walk more and eat less pie. For the first time all morning, Evelyn smiled. That's encouraging. She made several notes. From everything I've observed today, you're fully capable of making your own financial and legal decisions. I know that. I know you know. She looked directly at me. The challenge isn't convincing yourself. It's proving it if someone questions it. Those words settled heavily in the room, because that possibility no longer sounded far-fetched. It sounded real. Over the next 2 weeks, Evelyn coordinated with Daniel in the bank. Together they assembled a timeline. Every password reset, every address change, every modification to account notifications, every request for replacement cards, every authorization form. Nothing was exaggerated, nothing was assumed. If they couldn't prove something with documents, they left it out. We deal in facts, Evelyn reminded us. Facts don't need to shout. One afternoon, she slid a thick binder across the conference table. Take a look. Inside were copies of everything. My notebook entries, email printouts, bank records, phone logs, statements from Susan and Kevin, even screenshots showing when account alerts had quietly stopped going to my phone. I turned the pages slowly. The story practically wrote itself. Not because of one enormous betrayal, because of dozens of tiny ones. One small decision after another. Like removing bricks from a foundation until the house finally collapsed. Meanwhile, Brian and Melissa continued playing the role of devoted caregivers. At church, they insisted on carrying my Bible. Melissa would say loudly, "We just worry about him." Friends smiled. "You're lucky to have children who care so much." I'd smile back. They've certainly been involved. It wasn't a lie. After the service one Sunday, a couple from our Bible study approached me. "We heard Brian's helping you organize your finances." "That's thoughtful." I nodded politely. "It has been educational." I wondered how many people believed the story they were telling. Perhaps Brian believed it himself. That thought hurt more than anything. Because if he truly believed he was helping then, somewhere along the line, he'd stopped seeing me as his father. He'd begun seeing me as a problem to manage. The grandchildren remained blissfully unaware. Emma had just turned 11. Jacob was 9. Whenever they visited, they still raced through my backyard, chasing each other with water balloons, or begged me to make grilled cheese sandwiches. Children notice far more than adults realize. One afternoon, Emma looked up from her coloring book. "Grandpa." "Yeah, sweetheart." "Why does Mommy always ask Daddy if you remembered stuff?" I looked at her carefully. "What do you mean?" "She asks if you remembered your medicine." Emma shrugged. "Or if you remembered appointments." She frowned. "I don't think you're forgetful." Neither did I, but I simply smiled. Sometimes grown-ups worry too much. She nodded and went back to coloring. I watched her for a long time. Whatever happened next, I refused to let those children become casualties. Late one afternoon, Brian stopped by unexpectedly. He carried a folder under his arm. "Got a minute?" "Of course." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd once done algebra homework while Linda baked chocolate chip cookies. He opened the folder. "I've been researching senior communities." I looked at the brochures. Beautiful photographs, gardens, fitness rooms, dining halls. "You'd really like these places." "I'm happy here." "I know." His tone remained gentle. "But this house is getting harder to maintain." "It isn't. You don't have to mow anymore." "I enjoy mowing." "You wouldn't have to shovel snow." "I've survived 50 Ohio winters." He smiled patiently. "Dad." "What?" "I just want you somewhere safer." Safer. Another reasonable word. Another brick removed. I leaned back. "And what would happen to this house?" He answered too quickly. "We'd figure that out." "We." Not me. "We." "I'll think about it." His shoulders relaxed. "That's all I'm asking." After he left, I opened my notebook. Under today's date, I wrote only 4 words. He assumes agreement. A week later, Daniel called with unexpected news. "I think it's time." "For what?" "To protect yourself." That afternoon, we met with Evelyn again. For nearly 3 hours, we reviewed every part of my estate. My will, my retirement accounts, life insurance, the house, everything. "I don't want to punish Brian," I said. "I know. I still love him." Daniel nodded. "Nothing we're doing changes that. I don't want my grandchildren suffering because adults made mistakes. They won't." Together, we created a completely new estate plan. One built around transparency rather than convenience. An independent professional trustee would oversee anything involving significant assets if I ever truly became incapacitated. Not Brian, not Melissa. A licensed fiduciary with no personal interest. My home would be placed into a trust that could not be sold unless I approved it while competent, or unless multiple independent medical evaluations confirmed I no longer could. The safeguards weren't designed to keep my children out. They were designed to ensure no one person could quietly take over. Evelyn smiled as I signed the documents. This protects your wishes. It also protects my family. She nodded. Sometimes those are the same thing. Then came the final step, one that surprised even me. I want everyone together, I told Daniel. You mean Brian and Melissa? Yes. And who else? You. Evelyn. Susan from the bank. Kevin. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That's quite a dinner party. I smiled for the first time in weeks. It won't be a party. He understood immediately. No, it won't. I invited Brian over for Sunday dinner. Nothing unusual, just family. He sounded pleased. That'll be nice. I've also invited a few guests. Oh, my attorney. There was a brief pause. Anything wrong? No. What are we celebrating? I looked out the kitchen window toward the maple tree Linda had planted the year Brian graduated high school. Its branches swayed gently in the summer breeze. Just an important family conversation. When Sunday arrived, Brian and Melissa walked through my front door, carrying a homemade apple pie. Melissa smiled warmly. You look wonderful. I feel wonderful. She glanced toward the dining room. The table was already set. Extra chairs had been added. Daniel arrived first. Then Evelyn. A few minutes later, Susan walked in, followed by Kevin carrying a slim leather portfolio. Brian looked confused. Melissa's smile became noticeably tighter. What? What's all this? I motioned toward the dining room. Please. Let's sit down. Everyone found a seat. The room fell quiet. Brian looked around the table before turning back to me with an easy smile, the same confident smile I'd seen so many times over the past few months. Dad, he said, have you finally decided to let us handle everything? I met his eyes, and after weeks of waiting, I answered. Yes. The silence that followed my answer was almost comforting. Yes. Brian smiled with visible relief. Melissa reached across the table and squeezed his hand beneath the edge of the tablecloth. She thought I didn't notice. I noticed everything now. For weeks, I'd trained myself to. Brian leaned back in his chair. I think that's the right decision, Dad. I do too. His smile widened. I'm glad we're finally on the same page. So am I. Daniel quietly folded his hands. Susan and Kevin remained silent. Evelyn simply watched. Nobody rushed. Nobody interrupted. I looked around the dining room. This room had seen birthday cakes, Thanksgiving dinners, high school graduation parties, and Christmas mornings with wrapping paper covering every inch of the floor. Now it was about to witness something none of us would ever forget. I cleared my throat. Before we eat, I'd like to thank both of you. Melissa smiled. You don't have to thank us. I do. Brian nodded. We're family. I looked at my son. You've taught me something important. He seemed pleased. What was that? I answered honestly. You taught me how easily good intentions can become control. The room became still. Brian's smile faded slightly. I'm not sure I understand. I think you do. I reached beside my chair and picked up a blue binder, the same one Daniel and Evelyn had helped prepare. I placed it gently in the middle of the table. No one's in trouble. Melissa immediately crossed her arms. What is this? The story of the last 8 months. Brian looked confused. Dad, I'd like everyone to listen until I'm finished. Neither of them spoke. I opened the binder. The first change happened 8 months ago. I slid the first document across the table. The day my online banking credentials were reset. Brian looked down. I helped you with that. I know. The second change redirected fraud alerts from my phone to yours. He hesitated. So I could protect you. I nodded. I believe that. Another page. The third change lowered my spending limits. Melissa spoke quickly. That was just to reduce fraud exposure. Susan finally spoke. Our records show Mr. Walker was never informed of those limits. Melissa turned toward her. We were trying to help. Kevin answered calmly. Helping usually involves informing the account owner. No one raised their voice. No one needed to. Facts have a weight all their own. I continued turning pages. Replacement cards, address changes, phone number updates, email changes. Each document carried a date. Each date told a story. I watched Brian's face carefully. He wasn't angry. He looked unsettled, like someone slowly realizing the picture in front of him looked very different from the one inside his own head. Melissa remained composed. You signed authorization forms. I looked directly at her. No, you did. I didn't. Kevin opened his portfolio. We've already reviewed those documents. Melissa folded her arms tighter. So several signatures appear inconsistent with Mr. Walker's historical records. Brian looked sharply at Kevin. What does that mean? It means we're investigating how those authorizations were obtained. Brian turned toward Melissa. What is he talking about? For the first time all afternoon. She didn't answer immediately. Daniel spoke next. Brian, I'd like to ask you something. My son nodded slowly. Did your father ever tell you he wanted his mailing address changed? Brian looked confused. No. Did he ask you to cancel his credit cards? No. Did he instruct you to redirect security notifications? No. Brian looked at Melissa. I thought... He stopped. Daniel waited. You thought what? Brian swallowed. I thought Melissa had discussed everything with Dad. Every eye in the room shifted toward her. She looked genuinely surprised. You assumed I handled it. Brian stared. You told me you had. I told you he agreed. You said you talked to him. I did. When? She hesitated. I mentioned it. Mentioned it isn't the same as asking. The room fell silent again. I felt something inside me break. Not because of betrayal. Because I realized my son hadn't been leading every decision. He had stopped asking questions. That was almost worse. Evelyn spoke gently. Mr. Walker, may I ask Brian something? Of course. She turned toward him. When did you first begin believing your father couldn't manage his own affairs? Brian looked down at the table. I don't know. Think about it. Several seconds passed. Finally, he answered. After Mom died. My chest tightened. He continued quietly. He seemed lonely. I was. He forgot to return a library book. I almost smiled. I paid the fine. I know. You mixed up one doctor's appointment. Once. You asked me how to use online banking. Because technology changes. Brian rubbed his forehead. I kept seeing little things. Evelyn nodded. And what did those little things become? He closed his eyes. Evidence. Were they actually evidence? No. They were assumptions. He whispered the last word. Assumptions. I stood and walked into the kitchen. For a moment, I simply looked out the window. Linda loved watching birds gather around the feeder she'd hung years earlier. A cardinal landed on the fence. She used to say cardinals were reminders that people we loved never really disappeared. I wasn't sure I believed that, but I wished she were sitting beside me. She would have known exactly what to say. I returned carrying an old photo album. I opened it to a picture of Brian at 9 years old. He was standing proudly beside the Pinewood Derby car we'd built together. You remember this? He smiled despite himself. I couldn't get the wheels straight. So we stayed in the garage until midnight. You never gave up. Neither did you. I closed the album. When did you decide I deserved less patience than you did? His eyes filled instantly. Dad, no. My voice remained calm. I really want to know. He couldn't answer. Neither could Melissa. Finally, Brian stood. His chair scraped softly across the hardwood floor. I'm sorry. No excuses. Just those two words. I'm so sorry. He looked directly at me. I honestly believed I was protecting you. I know. I never wanted your money. I believe you. I thought if I handled everything... His voice cracked. Nothing bad could happen. I nodded slowly. And instead, I made something bad happen. Tears rolled freely down his face. Melissa looked at him with disbelief. Brian. He turned toward her. No. She froze. He shook his head. No more. He looked back at me. I should have talked to you. Yes. I should have trusted you. Yes. I stopped seeing you as my father. My heart ached. I started seeing you as someone I needed to manage. The honesty in that sentence filled the room. Melissa finally lowered her eyes. Quietly, almost too softly to hear, she said, I thought efficiency was kindness. Nobody answered, because there wasn't anything left to argue. Daniel broke the silence. Harold, there's one final matter. I nodded. I know. I looked at Brian. I've already signed a new estate plan. His face fell. I understand. You haven't heard it yet. I don't deserve anything. This isn't about punishment. I rested my hand on the binder. It's about protecting everyone, including you. He looked confused. What do you mean? I'll explain. But first, I looked around the table. I think we should finally eat dinner. For the first time in months, no one at that table was pretending anymore. Dinner was almost awkwardly ordinary. The roast cooled while the mashed potatoes were passed around the table. Someone asked if anyone wanted more green beans. Susan complimented my homemade dinner rolls, and Kevin admitted he'd gone back for a second helping before dessert. For a few minutes, nobody mentioned banks' legal documents or control. We simply ate. It reminded me of something Linda used to say whenever Brian and I argued over something silly. Nobody solves family problems on an empty stomach. She was right more often than either of us wanted to admit. When the plates were finally cleared, I poured fresh coffee for everyone. This time, I smiled to myself. Nobody's card needed to work for that cup. Daniel opened the new estate binder. Harold has asked me to explain the changes. Brian nodded quietly. I'm listening. The previous estate documents have been revoked. Neither Brian nor Melissa reacted. They simply listened. Mr. Walker remains in complete control of every financial decision. Daniel looked toward me, as he always should have. He continued, if Mr. Walker ever becomes genuinely unable to manage his affairs, that determination cannot be made by a family member. Brian looked up. Who decides? 2 independent physicians. Evelyn added, and even then, financial authority transfers only through an independent licensed fiduciary, not directly to any beneficiary. Brian slowly nodded. So no one in the family controls it. Correct. Melissa spoke for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. You don't trust us. I answered before anyone else could. No. The word landed heavily. Then I continued. I don't trust any one person with unchecked power. I let that settle. Not you. Not Brian. Not even myself. I looked at Daniel. That's why we built safeguards instead of assumptions. Daniel smiled slightly. Exactly. Then I explained the part that mattered most to me. My house has been placed in a living trust. Brian asked softly, can it still be sold someday? Of course. When I decide. I smiled gently. Or when I'm no longer alive. A small silence followed. This home isn't valuable because of the real estate market. I looked around the dining room. It's valuable because your mother loved it. I pointed toward the hallway. Those pencil marks on the wall measured your height every birthday. Then toward the backyard. That oak tree was planted the week you were born. Finally, I looked at the family photographs lining the shelves. A stranger sees property. I see my life. Brian lowered his head. I forgot that. I know. There was one more surprise. I pulled a thin folder from beside my chair. This has nothing to do with inheritance. Brian looked confused. What is it? I've established a small charitable fund. Melissa looked up. For what? Financial education. Evelyn smiled. Harold had spent weeks refining the idea. I nodded. It'll sponsor free workshops at our community library. Brian frowned. Workshops for older adults. About investing, about technology. Everyone looked puzzled. I explained. When you helped me set up online banking, I realized how many people my age feel embarrassed asking questions. I paused. They shouldn't. The room stayed quiet. I don't want another 70-year-old to hand over complete control simply because they're afraid of looking foolish. Susan smiled warmly. Our bank would be happy to participate. Kevin nodded. So would our fraud prevention team. Daniel added, I'll volunteer to explain powers of attorney and estate planning. I couldn't help smiling. Linda would have loved this, taking something painful and turning it into something useful. That had always been her way. The weeks that followed weren't easy. Trust doesn't grow back because someone says they're sorry. It grows because they behave differently. Brian called less often, not because he was avoiding me, because he had finally learned to ask instead of assume. One Saturday morning, he stopped by carrying a toolbox. I noticed your porch railing is loose. It is. I could fix it. You could. He stood there awkwardly. Would you like me to? I smiled. I'd appreciate that. One sentence, one question, one choice. It felt completely different. Melissa took longer. She wrote me a letter, not an email, an actual handwritten letter. She admitted she'd always believed efficiency solved every problem. Growing up, she'd watched her own parents struggle after her grandfather developed Alzheimer's disease. Her mother had often said, if we'd taken over sooner, everything would have been easier. Melissa carried that lesson into our family without realizing every situation wasn't the same. She confused preparation with permission, protection with control. She apologized without asking me to erase what had happened. That mattered. Forgiveness begins when excuses end. Summer slowly turned into autumn. The maple tree in my front yard glowed orange and red. Emma started middle school. Jacob proudly made the baseball team. Life stubbornly and beautifully kept moving. One Sunday after church, Brian asked if I'd like to have breakfast. Just the two of us. We went to the same little diner we'd visited when he was a teenager. After the waitress poured our coffee, he looked across the booth. I miss talking to you. I've been right here. I know. He stared into his cup. I spent months making decisions for you. I noticed. He smiled sadly. I forgot something. What's that? You've been making good decisions your whole life. I reached across the table and squeezed his shoulder. We all forget important things sometimes. He laughed softly. I guess I proved that. Almost exactly 1 year later on another Tuesday morning, I woke up before sunrise. Out of habit, I drove to the same coffee shop. The same cashier was working. She looked at me for a moment, then her face brightened. I remember you. I was hoping you wouldn't. She laughed. The coffee's still $2.89. I figured inflation hadn't won completely. She rang it up. I reached into my wallet, pulled out my credit card, inserted it into the reader. Approved. No hesitation, no decline, no embarrassment, just one quiet beep. The receipt printed. She handed me the cup. Have a wonderful day. You too. As I turned toward the door, someone called out behind me. Dad, Brian. He'd followed me there after our weekly breakfast tradition had become routine. He reached into his pocket. Let me get this one. I looked at him, then at the card already back in my wallet. I smiled. No. He hesitated. I've got it. I gently patted his shoulder. I know you mean well. I do. I've got this. He smiled, not the confident smile of someone taking charge, but the grateful smile of a son who had finally learned the difference between helping and controlling. I know you do, Dad. We walked out together into the morning sunshine, not as a man being managed, not as a son trying to manage, just as a father and son learning perhaps a little later than either of us wished that love without respect eventually becomes control. But love with respect becomes family again. As I drove home, I thought about that little cup of coffee. It had cost only $2.89, yet it had exposed months of silent assumptions, hidden fears, and misplaced good intentions. Sometimes the smallest moments reveal the biggest truths. Growing older doesn't mean surrendering your dignity. Needing help doesn't mean surrendering your voice. And if you truly love someone, you don't quietly take away their independence. You stand beside them, ask what they need, and honor the answer. If this story reminded you of someone you love, or perhaps made you see an aging parent, a grandparent, or even yourself in a new light, I hope you'll carry that lesson with you. And if it touched your heart, consider sharing it with someone who might need the reminder that respect is one of the greatest gifts a family can give. If you'd like to hear more stories about family forgiveness and quiet justice, you're always welcome to join us again.